And I think back when I was 20, if you told me, I was going to raise a family in a downtown townhouse, I'd be like, the hell's wrong with you? Like, Jesus, you hate your children or something? You can't build a place, again, like Wortly Village or anything like that are places that people legitimately like, places that people would love to live, places that people pay a lot of money to live in, and it's illegal to build them.
Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Cara Stern.
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
And today we're talking to YouTube star Jason Slaughter from Not Just Bikes about why North American suburbs are so bad and whether they're just doomed to stay bad.
But before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
So Jason, you talk a lot about how much you hate car-dependent suburbs, but I understand you grew up in one with Mike. Did you hate it then?
Well, that's a good question. I think when you grow up surrounded by car dependency, you don't know any different, right? And I do sometimes wonder, like, I can empathize with people who watch my channel and don't get it, because I do wonder if I was presented with this information when I was 18, what would I think of it? Because I clearly remember, like, really, really wanting to get my driver's license when I was young. Like, as soon as I was 15 and could take the practical test, I did. And then, as soon as I turned 16, it was like, boom, let's get that driver's license. And so the idea of saying, like, oh, actually, that's not really that important, and you can get around by walking, cycling, and public transit, I think it'd be like, you're out of your freaking mind.
It seems quite dangerous back then, especially. Like, I know that when I grew up in Vaughan, so I know that, as I think you described it as a suburban wasteland.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's right.
I know that cycling seemed like dangerous, super dangerous. Like, it just didn't seem like a thing anyone should do. And it didn't even cross my mind to do it. I remember my brother started cycling to school and my mom was terrified, even though he was going on the sidewalks, but on a busy street, like, it's still kind of scary, right? Like, when did you start thinking about that?
Well, yeah, I think actually that's a valid concern. A kid cycling to school in Vaughan, I think, is a problem. Perhaps it is legitimately dangerous. So when I started thinking about it, it's a little bit tough to say, because the thing was, I lived in London, Ontario. Of course, I went to Waterloo for school, which at the time was basically the same as London, Ontario. It's like London, Ontario light at the time, though it has improved quite a bit since then. And then I went on various co-op terms with the University of Waterloo, but I would go to, like, I worked in Mississauga, I worked in California, and it's all kind of the same stuff. So I think, to me, it didn't really really register for me until my wife and I moved to London, England. And we lived in a place, and I worked in Cambridge in the UK as well. And we lived in a place that, like, you didn't even want a car. Like, a car would be a liability at that point. And I think that was the real kind of eye-opener for me, because I had always assumed that, like, obviously you would want a car, obviously you would want to drive, but that was because I was living in places that were designed that way, right? If it's designed such that you have to have a car to do anything, even just buy groceries, then of course you're going to want a car. But if you're you're living in a place that is designed differently, then again, like, a car is not only not necessary, it may even be like a problem, because you got to find a place to park it, you got to deal with it getting broken in, and all these, you pay for it and everything else, and, like, I didn't even need one. And so after living for several years that way, it was kind of like, maybe there's something more to this.
That was your orange pill moment.
Perhaps. Certainly, I would say the real orange pill moment was when I went on business trip to Japan for the first time and saw, like, public transit in Tokyo. And then I was like, oh, damn, actually, this is pretty great.
So I gotta wonder, like, how did they get so bad? Like, these neighborhoods get so bad on so many dimensions. I remember the neighborhood next to ours. We'd go play road hockey there. A lot of afternoons.
Yeah.
This is a neighborhood from the 1960s. A lot of our friends lived there. And, I've actually sent you pictures of this, because I'm not even sure you remember this, but none of those roads had sidewalks, like zero of them, including the arterial roads in the subdivision. So what were people thinking back then? Like, why were these neighborhoods designed so poorly?
Well, I think when you really look through the history of it, well, there's two factors. One of it is that it all seemed like a good idea at the time. Like when cars came out, they allowed unparalleled freedom to people to just be able to go wherever they wanted, and cars are really useful, right? And so I think people maybe got a little overexcited about that possibility and thought, "Oh yeah, we're going to do this everywhere. We're going to like, who's going to walk anymore? Like, why would you even bother walking?" And that's where you get these subdivisions that just don't have a sidewalk because why would you do such a crazy thing now that cars are a thing? Um, and the other element of it is that the car industry had a very, very big role to play here. And I don't know if it's worth going into that history right now, but suffice it to say, there was quite a bit of money and lobbying that went into making sure that we built places where people needed to use their products. Like this is just a fact. Everything from defunding public transit. I mean, in the United States, car companies literally bought up public transit and destroyed it. Like they did this, and so there was certainly an element of that too. That it was like, the money's flowing in, especially if you do things this way. So that was an element to it. But again, I think if you went back at any single point in time, like from a general public point of view, nothing seemed like a really bad idea at the time. It all kind of seemed like, yeah, we were moving towards the future. And if you look at like the stuff from the 60s and even earlier into the 30s, like General Motors had this Futurama that showed what cities of the future would be like with these like highways whisking away traffic and never have a traffic jam again. I mean, it all probably seemed like a pretty good idea at the time.
But when you look back then, I can understand how people thought it was a good idea at the time. And nowadays, where we're like, okay, we know walking's like pretty good for you. And I know that you now have suburbs that do have sidewalks on a lot of the roads, at least on the arterial roads. They still design them in ways that are like, you're not really supposed to walk anywhere. There's not really like much to walk to. And they're designed in ways where it's very far to get anywhere within a subdivision. I just like, how come that hasn't changed since then?
Well, I think there's a couple of elements there. Well, there's certainly momentum that's been put in place. Again, like just when I think back to me being 20 years old or something, I didn't know that it could be any other way. So it's a little bit hard for people to imagine how things could be. Like I routinely get people telling me, like, "Oh yeah, yeah. Well, Europe can be that way because their cities are old, but our cities are designed for the car." And they that's just a myth. Like North American cities, Canadian cities were not designed for the car. Every single one of them had a train station. Every single one of them had a trolley, like literally all of them, even tiny ones you'd never think of. There were trains all over the place. Everybody walked places. There were streetcar suburbs that were very common, and we will certainly get into that later in this conversation. And then all that stuff was bulldozed. The trams were and the trolleys were torn out. The trains were turned into cargo trains, and now we're stuck with this. And then of course car dependent places have been built on the periphery of these cities. So I think there's an element that like we've gone down this path. There's also an awful lot of things that happened in legislation that make it literally illegal to build the nice places that we would like to build. Like if I think of a place called, what is it, Wortly Village? Is that the one in
Oh yeah,
in
Wortly
London?
Village in London. Yeah, just south
Yeah,
of downtown. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's a great little place, right? Like it's got some nice houses. There's detached, semi-detached. There's a bunch of shops. You can walk to everything. It's really, really nice little neighborhood. And in fact, like a lot of people want to live in Wortly Village in London, Ontario. But it's literally illegal to build that now because over the years in the 40s, 50s, 60s, we put legislation in place, some for good reasons, some because of lobbying, that made things built a certain way for cars. For example, minimum parking requirements, that when you build a place, you need to have a certain number of parking spaces, whether that's a shop or whether it's a house. The road design guidelines about the size of the road and the width of the lanes and all of these kind of things, they're set in stone. And you can't build a place, again, like Wortley Village or anything like that, that are places that people legitimately like, places that people would love to live, places that people pay a lot of money to live in, and it's illegal to build them.
I argue with Mike about this. You say it's set in stone, and I'm like, it's not set in stone. Things are changing, and they're changing fairly quickly. And I wonder if we'll see some of these changes because, like, In your video about streetcar suburbs, you talk about Riverdale in Toronto. And I mean,
Yeah.
I question whether that's a suburb. I'm like, that's basically Toronto at this point. It probably started
Well,
as a
it
suburb.
was a suburb at the time, and
Yeah.
I think that's the distinction. It was a suburb, and of course, the city expanded around it.
For
And I think
sure.
it's hard to look at it that way.
And I wonder whether that would be something that could be built if we're going to go back to that kind of direction. Do you think we can get there again over time?
I mean, I think it's definitely possible. Like I have only somewhat jokingly said that in order to fix your city, you just need to change all of your traffic design guidelines and your regulations around housing to be something sane. Then let things get built. Wait 30 years because everything needs to be replaced eventually. Every road, every pipe, everything. Wait 30 years and your city's good. And I think that is obviously a little bit silly, but it's not that silly. I mean, it really could be that we could bring these regulations back in line with, what's done in other countries and allow things to slowly develop, and the city could get better. There are still some issues related to urban sprawl, but I think that is a reasonable thing. And certainly, I mean, I often talk about a organization in North America called Strong Towns, which was started by a former traffic engineer. And they are definitely, like, if you have any interest in this at all, you really need to go to Strong Towns, especially if you live in the US or Canada. But they talk about how if we look at the traditional areas that are left, like the downtowns, the Wortly Villages, the Riverdales, and all those kind of things, and we roll back the clock on some of these crazy regulations that we put in place that force us to live in car dependency. But if we really focus on those places, we could make some fairly rapid change fairly quickly. Handling the totally car dependent exurb that was built last year is a bigger issue, but certainly we could focus on those, what they call traditional neighborhoods.
I have this theory that if you just get rid of the system where everyone's subsidizing the suburbs, because we know it's so much more expensive to service the suburbs, that if you can just get rid of those subsidies, get people to have to pay their own way, this will naturally solve itself because people won't just be able to afford to have the level of services that they actually want when they live in the suburbs, along with the lack of density that they want typically. Do you think that would happen?
Well, I mean, this is again something that Strong Towns talks about quite often. They call it the growth Ponzi scheme. They talk about how the suburbs are being subsidized heavily. And yes, I think so. I think in practice that's very difficult because you've got, especially in Canada, which is an extremely suburban nation. I think in terms of the world, it's actually the highest percentage of people that live somewhere car dependent of anywhere in the world. And I think one of the trick will be actually doing such a thing because you effectively make it more expensive for the majority of Canadians, which is something that's not going to go over well. But yes, I mean, if the suburbs actually had to pay for their infrastructure, like legitimately pay for what they need, all of those kilometers of arterial roads and pipes and sewage lines and electricity and all that kind of stuff, if they actually legitimately needed to pay for everything that they required, all of the infrastructure they required, and including the replacement cost for that infrastructure, I think that would push people towards more sustainable and more walkable living for sure. If we stopped subsidizing gasoline and everything else, the trick is actually implementing those policies in any reasonable time frame.
I mean, this leads me to the question that, if these neighborhoods are first of all so bad, and secondly so heavily subsidized, why are they also still so expensive and clearly desirable? So I like, this is a total, Gen X hobby, but I really like looking at real estate listings in the neighborhood that we grew up in.
It doesn't make you cry
London.
like it does millennials.
No, not at all. Well, in part because my parents still live in the house that we moved into nearly 40 years ago. So I love to see what's happening in those neighborhoods. And most of those homes in that neighborhood go for over $1 million in London, Ontario, of all places. So, which leads to the obvious question, if those suburbs are so bad, why are they simultaneously so expensive to move to?
Well, I mean, what's the alternative? Where else are you going to live? I mean, that's literally it in Canada, right? I mean, if you look at the price of the walkable neighborhoods, like I think about the place that you used to live near downtown London, Ontario, or if you look at something like Riverdale, they're even more expensive. Like people do want walkable neighborhoods, and whenever there's been, Pew Research does these things. There's a bunch of times that has been done. People do want the ability to walk to more places. People do want their children to be able to walk and cycle to school and to do it safely. These are things that people want. But again, because it's been effectively illegal to build these places for 70 years, the only ones that are left are the ones that were grandfathered in, and if they didn't get bulldozed, that is, to build highways and parking lots and everything else, then that's it. There's no other alternative. And so, yeah, I mean, the walkable places are the absolute most expensive. Then when you start talking about some of these older suburbs, yeah, the truth is that suburbs, when you look at the car dependent suburb of, say, the 1960s, the lot sizes were bigger, the houses were bigger. There are various things that were more desirable. And as suburbs became realized that suburbs really couldn't sustain themselves, suburbs are kind of getting crappier too, right? Like when you look at some of these new builds and you're in this like poorly made townhouse row in the middle of nowhere in Newmarket or something, you've kind of got all of the negatives of having to live more densely with none of the positives. Like you're still in a car dependent place, but in a type of housing that might be less desirable to people. And I think that's kind of the worst case scenario. So in a sense, some of these older places are just naturally going to be more desirable because they were built back in the days when the money was flowing in like crazy and nobody cared.
Is it possible that we can fix the suburbs that exist right now and actually make them more, I guess, more walkable? Or do we just have to go, those ones that already exist, well, they're doomed to always be terrible? Or can you actually make them better?
Well, it's interesting. I remember there was an article on strong towns that came out actually because of a discussion around not just bikes, and Chuck, who runs it, wrote this article about the stroads, which are those arterial roads that exist all over our suburbs. The 5 to 7 lane roads with all the big box stores on them and everything like that. And people said, well, how do you convert these things? How do you fix them? And he said, you can't. Like some of these are just going to have to be turned back into farmland. And that is part of the answer. Like some places are just going to have to be turned back into farmland someday. Like they never should have been built in the first place. They're completely financially and environmentally unsustainable, and they're just going to have to go. Now, that doesn't mean that all suburbs need to go. There is actually a good book called The Sprawl Repair Manual, which I would recommend to anybody that wants to look at this. That it talks about doing things like taking shopping malls and getting rid of all the surface parking and building it into a walkable neighborhood with some nice housing and things like that. And then the mall becomes also part of that community. Part of the trick, though, really does come down to money and opportunity cost. Because the thing is, if you look at some suburb that was built in the early 2000s that was only ever designed to be driven, that has no sidewalks, there's no way that you're going to get effective public transit to that density. There's nothing around it that you could possibly walk to. You could fix it. Anything's fixable. The question is, like, if you were going to spend $100 million, $1 billion fixing that, it might be better off maybe going to part of one of the traditional neighborhoods that we have, or something that's a little bit easier to fix. But I think the real trick is that we have to stop building this unsustainable car dependent suburbia, and that's the thing that bothers me the most. Canadian cities are very much recognizing that this stuff is unsustainable. If you look at the things Mississauga is doing, for example. But at the same time, there's lots and lots of these things still being built, right? We're still digging the hole deeper while we're also trying to fill it in.
That's so interesting. I wonder if it's partly just that it's quick. They're fairly quick to build, and with the growth levels that we have, I think people are still just wanting to choose that space because that's what they kind of feel suits their life better. Are people actually? Are people building it because people don't actually still want that?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. Mike and I actually talked on my podcast, The Urbanist Agenda, about this issue. But I think there's a couple of things. There is certainly a cultural element in Canada that and I see it. It's so funny to me, in now having lived in Europe for so long and been involved in these things in Europe, looking back, and when there's articles about housing, uh, a lot of them just talk about single family homes, like as if that's the only kind of housing, like as if you could never raise a family any other way. So there is this cultural thing that has happened. And again, I think back when I was 20, if you told me, I was going to raise a family in a downtown townhouse, I'd be like, "What the hell's wrong with you? Like, Jesus, you hate your children or something?" So I think there is a cultural element to it. But again, I mean, things are getting better with respect to the regulations, but it is way easier to build a car dependent suburban neighborhood in the middle of nowhere in Canada than it is to build anything else. Like, for
Mhm.
so many reasons. There's all of these regulations that I talked about, but there's also just the fact that these companies have been doing it for decades. Like, one of these suburban developers, it's like just turning the crank at this point, right? This is what they've been building forever. It's so easy to build it. The banks are comfortable financing it. The people who work there are comfortable projecting like how much money they're going to make. The builders are very comfortable building this stuff. Like, everybody knows how to build this. And so there is lost knowledge of how to build high quality walkable neighborhoods in Canada, because I've seen it done too. I've seen it done where a company that has only done residential in different ways tries to make like a mixed use walkable neighborhood, and they screw it up big time, because at every level of the organization and every partner that they work with, it's all new. And so it's going to be more difficult in every way. And like, as Mike and I talked about, the bank financing is a big part of that too. You come with something weird like that to the bank, and they're like, I don't know about this. I don't know. I don't know if I want to give you money for this weird, like, European thing that you're trying to do. Meanwhile, if you come to them with like, I want to build an exurb in the middle of nowhere, and it's going to have like 75 single family detached homes, they're like, yeah, no problem. Let's do it.
They know it'll sell.
Well, I mean, that's really it, right?
Yeah, and it is funny how so many of our issues that we talk about here on Missing Middle, they have nothing to do with housing. We talk about productivity and all these things really
Yeah.
do come down to this weird Canadian risk aversion, or this weird sort of Canadian, like, okay, this is how we've always done things, so we continue to do that. Do you see that in other parts of the world, or am I right that that's kind of uniquely Canadian?
I mean, the status quo is the status quo. I mean, that's kind of the same everywhere. However, I do think that happens a little bit more in Canada, to be honest. I mean, and when I think back about like, why does Toronto still have its streetcars? It's kind of because they never got around to tearing them out. Now, it was a good thing that they didn't, and they did tear out a bunch of them. But like, now cities are like clamoring to put those things back, right? And I find that some of that happens just because Canadians do tend to be a little bit slow on that stuff. I remember when the financial crisis happened in the United States, because of the subprime mortgages. And I remember talking with some Canadians about it, and we're like, "Oh yeah, those Americans, they're so dumb. Look at all these like stupid regulations. They lifted all these important regulations, and now everything's crumbling." And I'm like, we were in the process of putting those same regulations in. We were just like 10 years behind, right? Like, so it's I do see that sometimes, that it's kind of like Canada sometimes looks at what the US is doing and goes like, yeah, I guess we should probably get around to doing that. And it just takes longer.
Yeah,
That's
like the
why.
old saying goes, the early bird gets the worm, but the second mouse gets the cheese. And sometimes, sometimes there is benefit in waiting.
We'll let them make all the mistakes, and then we can. Well, I'd say we learn from it, but we don't seem to do that. It's a little weird. I'm like, why do we keep just building things, assuming that no one has ever done it before? And I'm like, we could just look what other
Yeah,
places
and
are
actually, this
doing.
is something that I do want to talk about before we run out of time here, because I've been to some suburbs, some new suburbs in Europe, and it really just blows me away. And this is like Germany, Netherlands, Norway, wherever it might be. I actually remember going to some suburbs around Oslo, and it was really amazing because they were building things like as a walkable community with all the things you need within a short walk. They were building bike paths there, but most importantly, they were building it all along transit lines into the city. So you were always within a short walk of your local train station that could take you into Oslo, within 15, 20 minutes. And that's also something that is it just doesn't happen in Canada at all, and it disappoints me because I've seen new suburbs. And again, this is one of these things that constantly comes up with when I'm talking to Canadians about my channel. There'll be things like, oh yeah, like Riverdale's great, but like, yeah, that's this old thing. We can't yeah, not everybody can live in these old neighborhoods. And I'm like, you can still build new stuff like that, right? Like Riverdale is good because it was built as a streetcar suburb where they put the streetcar lines out. They put the streetcar lines out before there were any houses too, right? And this is something that still happens routinely in other parts of the world. They'll plan a regional transit system. They'll plan a transit line. They'll build the transit line out to nothing with the plan of building a bunch of stuff around it so that when those people move in, they immediately have good, high quality transit from the start. And I think that's the critical component we're missing when it comes to good suburbs in Canada, because what we tend to do is we tend to just let developers build their sprawling single family home neighborhoods completely disconnected from everything else. Everybody moves in. Everybody needs to drive, obviously, because it was built that way. You can't go to work. You can't even like go to the grocery store without getting in your car in these places. Then traffic becomes really, really bad because everybody has to drive everywhere. So there's cars all over the place. And then we come in and say, oh, geez, man, traffic's really bad. We should put transit in here. And it's completely the backwards way of doing it, because now you're trying to squeeze transit into a place that was never designed for it. And you've got all the resistance of the people who are there who say, well, don't take a lane away from me. Look at how bad the traffic is. We got to keep 6 lanes here. And it's absurd to me, because you hear sometimes people talking about transit oriented development in Canada. But even then, when they talk about it, it tends to be like underdeveloped areas with transit. Like, for example, in Toronto, along the subway line, where there's still a bunch of single family homes, they'll say, oh, yeah, maybe we should put a couple of condos around this. As opposed to thinking like, we're going to build a new transit line. We're going to build it into this area that, let's say, used to have a bunch of warehouses. Literally nothing's happening right now. We're going to build the transit to it. It's going to look stupid for the first year it opens because you're like, why did you build this to nothing? But then over the next 10, 20 years, an entire neighborhood grows up around that. A walkable neighborhood where people can get around without a car, and they've got a great transit system there. And again, like, this is one of these things that I say constantly on my channel, frustrates me so much. Like, there's no solution to car traffic except viable alternatives to driving. But if you just build everything so that everybody has to drive everywhere all the time, and then try to put the viable alternatives on top after the fact, it's nearly impossible.
I'm really hoping politicians listen to that, because I had just heard about how in Ontario, our premier is apparently considering whether to build into one of his bills a new rule that says you can't cut down car lanes for bike lanes. The bike lanes can only go where you're not cutting down car lanes. And I just went, oh no, that becomes like a law? How would that's so regressive. I don't understand why they're even thinking about it, but apparently they are.
Well, and if that does become a law, I think we're going to have Jason back on to tell us why we're getting all of that wrong, because we absolutely are. So, Jason, thank you so much for coming on today. Really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been great.
Thanks so much for watching and listening, and thanks as always to our producer, Meredith Martin.
And if you have any thoughts on living in the suburbs, or why we should put a train between Lucan and London, please send us an email to missingmiddlepodcast@gmail.com.
And we'll see you next time.